My name is Clara Ashford. I'm 33 years old. 2 years ago, I signed a purchase agreement at a bank's foreclosure auction and bought my parents' house out from under the mortgage that was about to swallow it. The deed is recorded in Jefferson County under the name of a holding company nobody in my family has ever heard of. I've been paying the property taxes, the insurance, and the roof repairs ever since. My parents think they still own it. Last Saturday, I received a cream-colored envelope in the mail. Inside was a printed invitation to the Ashford family reunion, 40 guests, catered, at the house I'd grown up in. At the bottom, under a decorative line, there was a handwritten addition in my mother's looping cursive. It said, "Claire, you're on the guest list. Please RSVP to Meredith." Not an invitation, a guest list. My sister's guest list, at an event hosted in my house. I didn't call. I didn't cry. I set the envelope down on my desk, next to the recorded deed I keep in a brown accordion folder, and I opened the property file on my laptop to double-check something I already knew. 37 days until the reunion. Plenty of time. That deed was supposed to be a secret forever. I was supposed to be the quiet one. The daughter who sat in the corner, who didn't argue, who flexed around everyone else's plans. Instead, by 9:42 that Saturday night, I knew exactly what I was going to do. The only question was whether I'd walk in with the deed in my hand, or whether I'd let them hand it to themselves. Before I tell you what happened at that reunion, and what was on the document I carried in with me, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you're new here. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from. And if you've ever been written onto a guest list at an event that should have had your name at the top, hit that subscribe button. Now let me take you back. I'm a real estate developer, principal at a firm called Ashford Brooks Holdings. That's my name on the door, along with my business partner, Amelia Brooks, who I met at a foreclosure auction 8 years ago when we both bid on the same duplex and then bought it together on a handshake and a bottle of cheap wine. We started with single-family rehabs. Now we do mid-market multifamily, distressed assets, and the occasional ground-up infill project. We closed a 24-unit acquisition in March. Last month, we broke ground on a 48-unit build in a transit-oriented zone 3 miles from my parents' front door. My parents think I work in real estate. When they describe what I do to their friends, my mother says, "Claire dabbles in property." My father doesn't correct her. My older sister Meredith is 37. She's the golden child. That isn't a metaphor. That's the actual taxonomy my family operates on. Meredith runs what she calls a lifestyle brand, which is a Shopify store that sells candles and ceramic vases, funded for the last 6 years by my parents, and for the last 2 years by a line of credit my father co-signed. Her boyfriend is a man named Preston Hargrove, who flips cars and calls himself an entrepreneur. At Thanksgiving last year, Preston asked me what my side hustle was. I told him I owned a real estate firm. He said, "That's cute, like Instagram flipping?" I counted, 4 seconds. I said, "Something like that." My brother Nathan is 28. He's the silent one. He teaches 8th grade science at a public school 40 minutes from the family house, and he has known for most of his adult life that our family is cruel to me and that he benefits from staying quiet about it. He has apologized exactly twice, both times over text, both times deleted within a day. And then there are my parents, Richard and Diana Ashford. My father is a retired mid-level regional manager at a distribution company who spent my childhood telling me to not make waves. My mother is a retired school secretary who ran our household like a middle school hallway. Favorites, freeze-outs, whisper campaigns. She has called me difficult since I was 9. Here's the specific kind of overlooked I mean. My high school graduation, I was class salutatorian, accepted early to a business program I'd worked 3 part-time jobs to help fund. That same weekend, Meredith announced she was engaged to her college boyfriend. My graduation dinner turned into an engagement dinner. My mother gave a toast to Meredith. My father cried at the toast. Nobody mentioned the scholarship letter I'd brought in my handbag to show them. Meredith broke the engagement off 6 weeks later. I never got another graduation dinner. When I was 26, I put a down payment on my first investment property, a small single-family rehab in a neighborhood I believed in. I called my parents to tell them. My mother said, "Be careful, sweetheart. Real estate is very risky for young women." 3 days later, at Sunday dinner, my father announced that he'd co-signed a $45,000 loan for Meredith to expand her brand. Meredith cried into her wine. My mother said the loan was an investment in our family's future. My father looked across the table at me and said, "Claire, be happy for your sister." I was. By the time I was 30, I had 4 properties, a business partner I trusted, and a reputation in a small circle of regional developers as someone you could call at 7 a.m. on a Sunday. My parents asked me, every single holiday, whether I'd met a nice man yet. They never asked what I was working on. They asked my brother about his students. They asked Meredith about her candles. And they asked me, with a tone that was almost pitying, if I was still renting. I wasn't. I owned a 2-bedroom condo I'd bought at a foreclosure auction and renovated myself in 11 weekends. I didn't tell them. There didn't seem to be a point. The only person in the family who ever asked me real questions was my Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister, a retired paralegal who lived 45 minutes north in a small town called Ridgefield. Aunt Margaret had been present at every family event of my adult life like a witness attending a trial she'd already predicted the outcome of. She was the one who would catch my eye across a holiday table and nod slightly when my mother made a cutting remark, a tiny gesture that meant I saw that, I noted it, I'm with you. Aunt Margaret is going to matter later. Remember her. And there was one more thing. My father's house. Or, what I called, until 2 years ago, my father's house. It's a 4-bedroom colonial on a 2-acre lot in Westbridge, a township that had gentrified hard in the decade after I left for college. My parents had bought it in 1989 for $142,000, raised 3 kids in it, and by 2019 it was worth close to $680,000 on paper. That house, the pine-floored kitchen, the stone fireplace, the back porch where I used to read in the summers, was the one thing my mother talked about as if it were permanent. "This house will be in our family forever," she would say at Christmas, looking around the dining room. "Every Ashford has a place here." Every Ashford except the Ashford who actually ends up with the paperwork. I remember the first time I noticed the envelope. It was a yellow envelope on my father's desk in the den, with the return address of a bank I recognized, a regional lender that had a reputation for aggressive servicing. I was 31. I was helping my mother wrap Christmas presents. I walked past the den and saw the envelope, and saw the word "Notice" in red ink in the upper corner. I didn't say anything. I didn't open it. I just noticed. 3 weeks later, I called their mortgage servicer, using information I already had access to, because my father had once made me a co-authorized contact, in case anything happens to us. That access was still active. I learned my parents were 4 months behind on their mortgage, that my father had taken a HELOC against the house in 2017 to help fund Meredith's brand expansion, and that the total outstanding debt against the property was $438,000 on a home worth $670,000 on paper, but more like $580,000 in a quick sale scenario. The servicer had already filed a notice of default. They were 60 days from initiating foreclosure proceedings. I didn't tell my parents I knew. I asked my mother, gently, over the phone a week later, whether they were doing okay financially. My mother said, "We're fine, Claire. Don't be dramatic." I set the phone down. Something in my chest shifted. Not toward anger, toward something much quieter and much more organized. I called Amelia. I called my attorney, a man named Benjamin Rook, who'd closed every deal Ashford Brooks had ever done. I called Aunt Margaret. I said the same thing to all 3 of them. Here's what I'm thinking. Tell me if this is crazy. None of them said it was crazy. That's the first mention of the document I'm about to tell you about, the deed. It's not something I'm going to fully explain yet. Keep it in the back of your mind. 2 years before this guest list invitation arrived in my mailbox, I bought my parents' house out of foreclosure at a bank-held sale in the name of a holding company, and I never told them. That's the weapon. Let me show you how it came to sit in a brown accordion folder on my desk. The bank sale was a Tuesday morning in October, almost exactly 2 years before the reunion invitation arrived. The property had gone to a bank-held sale after my parents missed their 5th payment and failed to enter a loan modification. Not because the bank wouldn't give them one, but because my father, when the forbearance specialist called, told the specialist in a voice I later heard on a recording Aunt Margaret obtained, "My daughter Meredith is handling this for us." Meredith wasn't handling anything. Meredith was at a candle-making retreat in Sedona. The paperwork sat on her kitchen counter for 6 weeks, and then she threw it away when she moved apartments. I bid on the house through Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC. Not my name, not a name my parents would recognize. Amelia was co-bidder. Benjamin attended in person to make sure the filing cleared. The total bid was $461,000. Closing was 17 days later. Benjamin walked the recorded deed into the county recorder's office himself on a Wednesday afternoon and texted me a photo of the filing receipt with 3 words: "It is done." My parents, after the foreclosure sale closed, received a notice from the bank that the deficiency had been satisfied and the debt cleared. They didn't know who had bought the house. They assumed, I later learned from my mother in a phone call, that it was some investor. They were told by the bank that they could either vacate or enter a rental arrangement with the new owner. The new owner, through Benjamin, offered them a rental arrangement, $2,400 a month, well below market for that house in that township. My father accepted the arrangement in writing. He signed a lease with an LLC and never once asked to meet the landlord in person. The rent hit my business account on the 1st of every month for 24 months. I used it to pay the property taxes, the insurance, and a roof replacement. The remainder went back into Ashford Brooks Holdings as operating capital. On paper, I was the landlord. My parents were the tenants. They didn't know. Why didn't I tell them? I'm going to be honest with you about this. At first, it was protective. I wanted to make sure the house stayed in the family, and I wanted to give my parents time to stabilize. They didn't know how bad it had gotten, and telling them in that moment would have humiliated my father and probably sent my mother into a week of passive-aggressive silences. I wanted them safe in the house. I wanted their Christmas tree in the living room and my mother's herb garden in the backyard and the pine floors under their feet. Then, about 6 months in, I noticed something. Nothing changed. My mother still called me difficult. My father still told me to not make waves. Meredith still lived there for long stretches between her various failed ventures, eating food I was essentially paying for, sleeping in a bedroom I owned, and complaining about me behind my back at the dinner table. And then my mother started talking about the house as if nothing had happened. As if the foreclosure, which she never fully explained, had been a misunderstanding with the bank. As if they still owned it. At Thanksgiving the year after the sale, my mother said, across a table where I was sitting with my fork halfway to my mouth, "This house will go to Meredith someday. She's the one who loves it most." I didn't choke. I didn't correct her. I set the fork down and I looked at Aunt Margaret, who was sitting 2 seats down, and Aunt Margaret looked back at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. It was the expression of a woman watching a fuse she had helped light burn down. That's when I stopped thinking of the deed as protection. That's when it became something else. Okay, let me pause here. If you've ever paid a bill for someone who then told other people it was their money, I see you. Drop a comment and tell me about it. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button because what comes next is where the house of cards starts to fall. The reunion invitation arrived on a Saturday. By Monday morning, I had a second envelope on my desk. The second envelope came from a title company called Heritage Settlement in a neighboring county. I'd never heard of them. The envelope was addressed to Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC, at my business address. Inside was a courtesy letter, 3 paragraphs long, formal, signed by a closing agent named Tanya Whitley. The letter informed the record owner of the property at my parents' address that a quit-claim deed had been presented for recording by a party claiming authority to transfer the property, and that the title company had flagged the transfer because the recorded title history did not match the grantor's claim. The letter asked, politely, whether the record owner would like to contest the filing or provide additional documentation. I read the letter 3 times. A quit-claim deed from a party claiming authority on my property. I called Benjamin Rook at 9:14 a.m. I read him the letter. Benjamin, who does not use profanity in professional contexts, paused for a long time and then said a single, very specific word that I am not going to repeat here. Then he said, "Claire, someone is trying to sell the house." "My parents can't sell the house," I said. "They don't own the house." "Exactly," Benjamin said. I set the letter down on my desk. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the county recorder's online portal. I searched the address. The recorded owner was still Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC, as it had been for 2 years. There was no valid transfer. But there was a pending filing, a quit-claim deed submitted 4 days earlier, held for review because the recorder's software had flagged the chain of title discrepancy. The grantors listed on the quit-claim deed were Richard Ashford and Diana Ashford. The grantee listed was Meredith Ashford. I counted 8 seconds. Then I called Aunt Margaret. Aunt Margaret picked up on the second ring. Before I could say anything, she said, "You got the letter." I said, "How did you?" She said, "I got a call from Benjamin yesterday. He wanted me to know first so I could tell you before the reunion. Claire, there's more. Sit down." I was already sitting. I sat down harder. Aunt Margaret, over the next 40 minutes, told me what she had been piecing together for 3 weeks. Meredith and Preston had gotten engaged in August. Not publicly, not formally, but in the way they tell certain family members and leave others to find out at events. Preston's parents, a couple who lived in a wealthier township 30 minutes east and who owned a chain of dry cleaning businesses, had informed Preston and Meredith that they would gift the couple a wedding present in the form of a down payment contribution toward a home. Meredith had told Preston's parents that her own parents were gifting the family house to her, free and clear, at the reunion as part of the engagement celebration. The reunion, I then understood, was not a reunion. It was an announcement event. My parents and Meredith were planning to announce the engagement and the gift of the house in the same breath to the assembled 40 guests. Preston's parents were going to attend. The gift was going to be formalized by the handing over of the quit-claim deed, a deed my parents had no legal right to execute. And there was one more layer. Meredith and Preston were planning to turn around and immediately take out a $380,000 home equity line against the house to fund a combined venture, a lifestyle destination in Sedona, which was a real estate development Preston's family had already partially committed to. The HELOC application was already in underwriting at a credit union Preston's family did business with. The underwriter was waiting on one document, the recorded deed showing Meredith as owner. If the quit-claim deed had recorded successfully, the HELOC would have funded within 10 days. The money would have been spent within 30. The chain of fraud would have been 4 transactions deep before any of it surfaced in a public record my parents could read. My parents, Aunt Margaret said, had no idea Meredith was planning the HELOC. My parents believed they were giving the house to Meredith as a pure gift, one that Meredith would preserve for the family. My father had drafted the quit-claim deed himself using an online legal template and had signed it in front of a notary at a UPS store. My mother had signed as a witness. They had both believed they were transferring a house they owned. They don't own it. They haven't owned it in 2 years. The quitclaim deed my father signed was, legally speaking, a worthless piece of paper. He transferred nothing. Meredith received nothing. The HELOC, once it got to title verification, was going to die on a desk. But the intent was there. And the intent, combined with notarized signatures, could, if pursued, be treated as attempted conveyance of property they did not own, which is, depending on jurisdiction and prosecutorial appetite, a category of fraud. Aunt Margaret said, "Claire, you could let the title company kick this back quietly. It dies in underwriting. Preston's parents find out the easy way. Your parents are embarrassed. Meredith is exposed. Nobody knows you own the house." I said, "And the reunion still happens." She said, "And the reunion still happens. And your mother stands up and tells 40 people that Meredith is getting the house that isn't hers to give. And you sit there like you always do." I didn't say anything. I just listened to Aunt Margaret breathe on the other end of the line. Then she said, very quietly, "Or you can go." I hung up with Aunt Margaret and I sat at my desk for a long time without doing anything. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't pour coffee. I didn't call Amelia, though I wanted to. I was 33 years old, sitting in a home office I owned, in a condo I owned, wearing a cashmere sweater I'd bought with money I had earned. And I was in the body of a 16-year-old girl, standing in the kitchen of that pine-floored colonial, listening to her mother tell her that Meredith deserved a car because Meredith had more to lose if she didn't have reliable transportation. I was 16 again. I was 14. I was 9 and being told I was difficult. I was every age at once. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I stood up and I walked the 4 steps from my desk to the kitchen of my condo, and I made a cup of tea with the kettle my grandmother, my father's mother, the one Ashford who ever saw me clearly, had given me when I graduated from college. The kettle whistled. I poured water into a mug. I walked back to my desk. I sat down. I drank the tea. Something in my chest didn't break. It settled. I want to pause here for a second. If you've ever realized in a single afternoon that the people you grew up loving had been counting on your silence to execute a plan you would have stopped if they'd asked you, I see you. Drop a comment. Tell me, what did you do in that moment? Did you call someone? Did you keep driving? Did you sit in your car in a parking lot and not move for an hour? Tell me. I want to know. And if this story is hitting close to home, subscribe, because the next 2 weeks before the reunion is where I stopped being the girl at the bottom of the guest list and started being the landlord. The next 2 weeks were logistics. I called Benjamin. We met in his office on a Tuesday morning. Benjamin is a methodical man. He wore a gray suit and a tie the color of slate, and he laid out a single yellow legal pad on the conference table, and we built the timeline backwards from the reunion date. 34 days to reunion. Benjamin filed a formal objection with the title company, with supporting documentation showing Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC, as a recorded owner, including the original foreclosure deed from 2 years prior, the chain of tax payments, the insurance records, and the recorded rental agreement my father had signed. The title company acknowledged receipt within 48 hours. The quitclaim deed, Benjamin informed me, was now in a permanent queue marked "Cannot Record, Conflicting Claim." It would sit there until one party resolved the conflict. My parents and Meredith did not know the deed had been flagged. 28 days to reunion. I met with a forensic accountant named Devin Pruitt, who Amelia had used on a commercial deal 2 years earlier. I asked Devin to pull the public records on Preston Hargrove and his parents' business. Devin came back in 4 days with a report. Preston's parents' dry cleaning business had been sued twice for wage theft in the past 5 years, settled both cases, and had a lien filed by a commercial landlord that was still open. Preston himself had 2 prior civil judgments against him for unpaid vendor bills on a previous lifestyle venture in Arizona. The lifestyle destination in Sedona was on land Preston's parents had optioned, not purchased, and the option was set to expire in 11 weeks. They needed the HELOC money to exercise the option, or they lost the deposit. 20 days to reunion. Benjamin and I drafted a document I want to describe to you carefully. It was a single-page letter on Ashford Brooks Holdings LLC letterhead, addressed to Richard and Diana Ashford, copying Meredith Ashford, stating in plain language the following. A. The undersigned entity is the record owner of the property. B. The lease agreement between the entity and the Ashfords remains in effect. C. Any purported transfer of the property by anyone other than the undersigned entity is void and unenforceable. D. The entity is aware of a recent attempt to record a quitclaim deed and reserves all legal remedies. Benjamin asked me, "Do you want to send this now or at the reunion?" I said, "The reunion." He said, "You're sure?" I said, "I'm sure." 14 days to reunion. I stopped the auto payment my father had set up 2 years earlier to send the rent from his bank account to the LLC's account. I called the bank and reversed the instruction without telling him. Then I contacted Meredith's credit union underwriter, very politely, through Benjamin, a formal letter from counsel stating that the property being used as collateral for any pending loan application was not owned by the applicant, and that the entity would pursue interference claims against any party funding the loan with knowledge of the title defect. The underwriter, I later learned, stopped the loan application on a Thursday afternoon. Meredith did not know. Preston did not know. Preston's parents did not know. The loan was dead. The HELOC was dead. The Sedona option was about to die with it. 12 days to reunion. I drove, alone, past the house at dusk on a Wednesday. I did not stop. I did not pull into the driveway. I just drove past slowly, and I looked at the front porch where my father was sitting with the newspaper. And I looked at the upstairs window that had been my bedroom from age 6 to age 18. And I looked at the 2 acres of lawn I was now paying someone named Miguel to mow twice a month. I did not feel sad. I did not feel angry. I felt, more than anything else, like an adult driving past an asset on her balance sheet, which happens to be the place where she learned to read. Both of those things can be true at the same time. I had spent most of my life pretending they could not. 10 days to reunion. I had my assistant at Ashford Brooks prepare a small leather portfolio, the kind of professional folio an attorney or investment banker carries into a meeting. Into the portfolio I placed a certified copy of the recorded deed from 2 years prior, a certified copy of the current title report showing Ashford Brooks Holdings LLC as owner, copies of 24 months of property tax receipts, copies of 24 months of rental payments from my parents' bank account, the insurance binder, the roof replacement invoice from the prior spring, Benjamin's letter to the title company, and one additional document I'll tell you about when I tell you what I placed on the table. 9 days to reunion. Benjamin called me on a Thursday afternoon. He said, "Claire, I want to be careful with you." I said, "Careful how?" He said, "You have a legal position that is unimpeachable. You can deploy it any way you want. But I am obligated, as your attorney and also as someone who has watched you work for 8 years, to ask you one question." I said, "Ask it." He said, "Are you sure you want to do this in front of 40 people? Because the law doesn't require that. You can serve the notice in a lawyer's office on a Monday morning, and the house is still yours on Tuesday." I was quiet for a long time. Then I said, "Benjamin, they were going to do it in front of 40 people. I am matching the audience." He said, "That is not a legal answer." I said, "No, it's a different kind of answer." He said, "Okay, I will be on my phone Saturday night." I thanked him. I hung up. I noticed that my voice had not shaken once during the entire call. 7 days to reunion. My mother called me. She wanted to confirm my RSVP. Her tone on the phone was bright. "Claire, honey, you haven't responded to Meredith yet. It's important that we have an accurate count for the caterer." I said, "I'll be there." She said, "Wonderful. Meredith has you at the end of the second table near the kitchen. She thought you'd be more comfortable there." I said, "That sounds fine." She said, "Also, we have a little announcement that night. We're so excited. I just know you'll be happy for your sister." I said, "I can't wait." I hung up. I sat at my desk. Something in my chest didn't shift this time. It held steady. In the last 5 days before the reunion, the family pressure became steady background noise. Meredith texted me a long message about how she really hoped I could be adult about this weekend, and how she knew I was a little sensitive about family events. My father called to ask if I could help him move some furniture out of the basement the morning of the reunion. Not because he wanted my help, but because, I realized afterward, he wanted me there early so I'd be in the right mood for the evening. My mother sent me a Pinterest link to a floral centerpiece and asked my opinion as someone who works with aesthetics. I'd never once in 33 years heard my mother use the word aesthetics. Nathan, my brother, called once. He said, "Claire, something weird is happening with the house. Dad was on the phone with a title company 2 days ago and he was yelling. Do you know anything?" I said, "Nathan, are you going to be at the reunion?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Then sit near me." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." That was the first time in our adult lives that I had told Nathan where to sit, and the first time he'd agreed to anything I asked without negotiating it. I bought a navy blazer, not flashy, tailored, professional. I had my hair trimmed. I did not do anything dramatic with my appearance. I wanted to look, when I walked into that reunion, exactly like what I was, a 33-year-old real estate developer who had come to a Saturday event with a leather portfolio under her arm. I spent Friday night before the reunion at my condo with Amelia. We ordered Thai food. She asked me, across the coffee table, whether I was scared. I said, "No." She said, "Are you sad?" I said, "A little, but that's not why I'm doing it." She said, "Why are you doing it?" I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, "Because my mother is going to stand up in front of 40 people and tell them a story about my family that isn't true, and I am tired of being the only person in the room who knows the true one." Amelia nodded. She poured more wine. We ate pad thai. And at some point, in the middle of a very ordinary evening, I realized I was calm in a way I hadn't been in 20 years. I have a question for you. If you knew your family was about to stand up in front of 40 people and publicly give away something that belonged to you, and you knew that you could let it die quietly in a back office, or walk in and deliver the truth yourself, which would you choose? Drop your answer in the comments. Quietly or myself? I want to hear. And if you want to see how that Saturday actually unfolded, hit that like button, because we're about to walk into that house. Saturday, 4:47 p.m. I pull into the driveway of the house I've owned for 24 months. The driveway is a semicircle of crushed stone, bordered by boxwoods I had trimmed back last fall because my parents couldn't afford the landscaper anymore and didn't know I was paying for one. The porch lights are on. A string of catered white lanterns runs along the front eaves. A valet, a teenager in a black vest hired for the evening, opens my door. I hand him my keys. I keep the leather portfolio under my arm. I walk up the 4 slate steps to the front porch. The front door is open. Inside, there are already 20, maybe 25 people in the front rooms. Cousins, great aunts, my father's brother, Uncle Gerald, 2 of my mother's old friends from church, and a cluster of people I don't recognize who must be Preston's parents and their circle. The air smells like gardenias and like the specific lemon polish my mother has used on the front hall wood since I was a child. Jazz is playing from a speaker in the living room. Somewhere in the kitchen, a caterer is running a dishwasher I paid to have installed last April. Meredith is standing by the fireplace in a cream-colored dress, laughing at something Preston is saying. Preston is wearing a navy blazer that is almost exactly the same color as mine. My mother is across the room, talking to a woman I assume is Preston's mother, a tall woman in pearls. My father is in the doorway between the living room and the dining room, with a drink in his hand, looking tired. I see Aunt Margaret in the far corner by the bay window. She sees me. She nods. I see Nathan by the staircase. He sees me. He straightens up. My mother sees me. She crosses the room in that walk she has, the one that looks warm to people who don't know her and looks predatory to people who do. And she puts a hand on my elbow and says, "Claire, you're here. Oh, you look nice. A little severe, but nice. Meredith is so happy you came." I say, "Thank you for inviting me." She says, "Oh, of course, your family." I say nothing. I just let that hang in the air for a second. Then she's already moving me toward the dining room, one hand on my elbow, narrating people she's going to introduce me to. She introduces me to Preston's mother. "Cynthia, this is my younger daughter, Claire. She's in real estate." And Cynthia gives me the kind of smile women give people they have already decided don't matter. I say, "It's very nice to meet you." Cynthia says, "You too, dear. Meredith has told us so much about this lovely house." I say, "It is a lovely house." My mother moves me along. She puts me at my assigned seat, the end of the second table, near the kitchen, exactly where Meredith placed me. The place card says Claire in Meredith's handwriting, the same handwriting from the guest list invitation. No last name, just Claire. I sit down. I place the leather portfolio on the chair next to me, upright like a briefcase. I do not open it. Aunt Margaret is seated directly across from me. Nathan is 2 seats to my left. Uncle Gerald is next to Nathan. Amelia is 3 hours away right now at her son's soccer tournament, but I texted her when I pulled in and she is on standby if I need her. The table is set with my mother's good china, the china I grew up eating off of, the china that, legally, belongs to whoever owns the house. Dinner begins at 5:30. My father gives a short welcome speech I don't hear most of. Toasts are offered. Meredith laughs loudly at a story one of Preston's relatives tells. My mother refills wine glasses. I drink water. Around 6:15, Preston stands up to give a toast to Meredith. His toast lasts 9 minutes. He describes Meredith as the most creatively gifted woman I've ever met. He describes her curatorial eye. He describes her as a woman who turned a candle brand into a lifestyle movement. I do not react. I do not smile. I sit quietly and I count Preston's uses of the word movement. 6 times, I counted. Around 6:35, my mother stands up to give a toast to her daughters. This is the toast I have been waiting for. My mother holds her wine glass with both hands. She says, "I want to say a few words about family, about what family means, about what we pass down." I look at Aunt Margaret. Aunt Margaret looks at me. My mother says, "I've been thinking about this house. This house has been the heart of our family for more than 30 years. It has seen every Christmas, every birthday, every heartbreak, every celebration. This house is not a building. It is a story." I set my water glass down very gently. My mother says, "And tonight, Richard and I have decided to pass that story on." The room quiets. Even the caterers stop moving. My mother says, "Meredith, sweetheart, you have always been the one who loved this house the most. You have always been the one who understood what it means. And so tonight, your father and I are giving you the house. Tonight, in front of everyone we love, we are making it official. This is your inheritance, early, because you and Preston deserve to start your life with a foundation." She reaches behind her chair. She lifts a manila folder off the sideboard. She places it on the dining room table, open, so that everyone can see the document inside. It is the quitclaim deed. The one Benjamin got flagged at the title company 2 weeks ago. The one sitting in a permanent queue marked, "Cannot record, conflicting claim." My father stands up. He's holding a pen. He walks around the table and hands the pen to my mother. My mother places the pen on the deed with a small flourish, as if she is about to sign it ceremonially, even though she has already signed it weeks ago in front of the notary at the UPS store, which my father has apparently forgotten, or chosen to forget, in the choreography of the evening. Preston is filming this on his phone. His mother is smiling the thin smile of a woman calculating the present value of a free house. Meredith stands up. She is crying, beautifully, on cue. She says, "Mom, Dad, I don't know what to say. This is everything. This is everything." 40 guests applaud. I sit very still. I feel Aunt Margaret's eyes on me. I feel Nathan's eyes on me. My mother turns, holding the quitclaim deed, and she looks directly at me. Her smile is sharp, her voice is sweet. She says, "Claire, sweetie, would you come up here and witness this with us? As Meredith's sister, it would mean so much." The room turns to look at me. I counted. 4 seconds. Then I stand up. I pick up the leather portfolio. I do not walk to the head of the table. I walk instead to the sideboard where my mother is standing, because that is closer to the center of the room, and I stop there. Meredith is 2 feet from me. My father is 1 foot behind her. My mother is holding the quitclaim deed in her left hand and the pen in her right. I say, in the same voice I use in investor meetings, "Before anyone signs anything, I need to share a few documents with the family." My mother's face flickers. Meredith's smile freezes. Preston's phone is still recording. I place the leather portfolio on the sideboard next to my mother's quitclaim deed. I open it. I take out the first document, a certified copy of the recorded deed from 2 years ago, stamped by the Jefferson County Recorder's Office, dated October of the year my parents went into foreclosure. I hold it up. I say, "This is a certified copy of the recorded deed for this property. The recorded owner of this property is Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC. The recording date is 2 years ago this month. The deed has been on file without contest for 24 months. My mother laughs. It is a small, disbelieving laugh. The laugh she uses when she wants to signal to a room that someone is being difficult. She says, "Claire, what on earth?" I take out the second document. I set it on the sideboard next to the first. I say, "This is the current title report, pulled yesterday. The owner of record is Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC. There are no competing claims on the title." I take out the third document. I say, "This is the original foreclosure sale document from the bank that held the prior mortgage. The bank took title after the foreclosure sale closed in October 2 years ago. The bank conveyed title to Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC 17 days later for $461,000, paid in full, no financing." My father is still standing behind Meredith. He has gone the color of the pine floor. I take out the fourth and fifth documents together. I say, "These are 24 months of lease payments from Richard and Diana Ashford to Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC, at $2,400 a month. This is the signed lease, dated 23 months ago, between Richard Ashford as tenant and Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC as landlord. The lease is current." The room has gone completely silent. The caterers have stopped moving. Even Preston's phone has lowered slightly because Preston has forgotten what he is doing. I take out the sixth document. I say, "This is a letter from the Heritage Settlement Title Company, dated 3 weeks ago, flagging the quitclaim deed my mother is currently holding as unrecordable due to a chain of title defect. The quitclaim deed my father signed in front of a notary 6 weeks ago transfers nothing. It cannot transfer anything, because Richard and Diana Ashford have not been the owners of this property for 2 years. My mother says, very quietly, "Claire, what are you doing?" I do not look at her. I look at the 40 people in the room. I say, I am Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC. I bought this house at a bank-held foreclosure sale 2 years ago when my parents defaulted on their mortgage after a HELOC taken out against the house for Meredith's business. I paid $461,000 in full. I have paid the property taxes, the insurance, and the repairs on this house for the last 2 years. My parents have been paying me rent through a lease they signed for 2 years. They did not know I was the landlord. I did not tell them. I let them stay in this house because I wanted them safe. I did not sell the house. I did not develop the house. I preserved the house. And I did so at a net cost of approximately $38,000 of my own money after rent and tax offsets over 24 months. I take out the 7th and final document, the one I haven't told you about yet. I say, this is a document from the credit union where Meredith and Preston applied 2 weeks ago for a $380,000 home equity line of credit on this property using the quitclaim deed as proof of ownership. That loan application is dead. The credit union received notice from my attorney 11 days ago. It has been formally withdrawn. The Sedona land option that the loan was intended to fund will expire in approximately 7 weeks with no further action from Preston's parents. Preston's mother, Cynthia, turns to look at Preston. Cynthia's face does a thing that I don't think Cynthia has let her face do in public in a very long time. I place the final document on top of the stack. I say to my mother, in a voice that is exactly as steady as I intended it to be, Mom, you cannot give Meredith this house. You don't own this house. I do. Aunt Margaret stands up. She does not raise her voice. She simply stands, places her napkin on the table, and says, loud enough for the full room to hear, everything Claire just said is accurate. I have known about the foreclosure sale and the purchase by Ashford Brooks Holdings, LLC, since the day Claire bid on the house. I have the bank's notice of default from 2 years ago in a file in my home office. I have a copy of the recorded deed. I have watched Claire pay the taxes and the insurance and the repair bills on this house for 24 months, while her parents have paid her rent and her sister has lived in this house for free, and her mother has told us at holiday dinners that this house will belong to Meredith someday. I have sat at that table, she points at the dining room table, and listened to my own sister tell lies that she did not know were lies. I have said nothing because Claire asked me to say nothing. She is not asking anymore. Aunt Margaret sits back down. She picks up her wine glass. She takes one careful sip. Nathan stands up next. My brother. The silent one. He says, in a voice I have never heard him use before, I knew something was wrong 2 weeks ago. I called Claire. She told me to sit near her tonight. That's why I'm over here. I should have asked more questions years ago. I'm sorry, Claire. He sits down. My mother's hand is shaking. The quit-claim deed is trembling in her fingers. She looks at my father. My father is not looking back at her. My father is looking at the pine floor. My mother says, too loudly, Claire, how could you do this? How could you embarrass your family like this? I say, I didn't embarrass our family, Mom. I spent $461,000 to keep this family in this house. The embarrassment is what you are about to do in front of 40 people based on a document you didn't understand. My father says, without looking up, Diana? My mother says, Richard, don't. My father says again, Diana. My mother's voice rises. This is ridiculous. This is a misunderstanding. Claire, we can work this out. We're family. This is a family matter. I say, the deed is recorded, Mom. The lease is signed. The HELOC is dead. There is nothing to work out. Meredith, at this point, sits down in a dining chair. She does not cry performatively anymore. She puts her hands on the table, palms flat. She looks at me. For the first time in 37 years, she looks at me like I am a person with a name and a face and a role in a story she thought she was writing. Cynthia, Preston's mother, stands up. She says to my mother, "Diana, I think Preston and I need to step outside for a moment." Cynthia, Preston, and Preston's father, a quiet man in a tan jacket who has not spoken in the last 7 minutes, leave the dining room. They do not come back. My father sits down, heavily, in the chair at the head of the table. He puts his hand over his eyes. My father says, to no one in particular, to the entire room, "I've always been a coward. I knew we couldn't afford the HELOC. I knew we shouldn't have signed for Meredith's loan. I knew Claire was the one who would have helped us if we'd asked. I knew all of it, and I didn't say a word. I let your mother run it." My mother says, "Richard, stop." My father says, "No, Diana, I'm done stopping." I stand in front of the sideboard with a stack of documents and a leather portfolio, and I watch my father, for the first time in my life, tell the truth in a room full of people. Let me tell you what happened over the next 72 hours. Sunday morning, 9 a.m. The title company formally rejected the quitclaim deed and sent certified notice to the notary at the UPS store who had notarized my parents' signatures. The notary's commission was flagged for review by the State Commission Board, pending investigation into whether appropriate diligence had been performed on the grantor's authority to convey the property. Sunday afternoon, 1:15 p.m., Preston's parents' attorney called Benjamin Rook. The attorney demanded to know the current status of the property. Benjamin provided a summary in writing. Preston's parents' attorney then informed Benjamin that Preston's parents were reevaluating the engagement, which I understood to mean Preston was being told by his mother in a private conversation that the wedding was off. Sunday evening, 6:30 p.m. The Sedona land option expired 3 weeks early because Preston's family could not wire the exercise fee without the HELOC money. The deposit, I don't know the exact number, but Aunt Margaret had heard Preston mention $85,000, was forfeit. Monday morning, 8 a.m. My father called Benjamin Rook directly. My father asked, in a voice Benjamin described to me later as quiet and very tired, whether Richard and Diana Ashford could remain in the house. Benjamin said, "That's Claire's decision." My father said, "I understand. Please tell her I'm not going to fight her. I'm grateful she didn't let us lose it." Benjamin conveyed the message. Monday afternoon, 2 p.m. Meredith's business line of credit, the one my father had co-signed for 6 years ago, that had been rolling ever since, triggered a default notice from the lender because Meredith had used the quitclaim deed in her loan documentation package, and the lender had done a routine title check and flagged the misrepresentation. The lender called the loan due. My father's personal guarantee was activated. The outstanding balance, $74,000. Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. Preston broke off the engagement. Not in person, by text. Meredith found out when Aunt Margaret's daughter, my cousin Reagan, saw Preston at a coffee shop with a different woman and posted an Instagram story that I did not see directly, but that was described to me by 3 separate relatives within 90 minutes. Tuesday afternoon, 4 p.m. A reporter from a regional real estate trade publication, not a gossip outlet, a real one that covers local transactions, called the office at Ashford Brooks Holdings. She had seen the Jefferson County filing from 2 years ago cross-referenced against the rejected quitclaim deed from last week. She wanted to know if Ashford Brooks Holdings would comment on an unusual private family foreclosure acquisition that appeared to have surfaced. I declined comment through Amelia. The story did not run, but the fact that it could have, and that my parents could have read about themselves in a local real estate paper, became, for my mother, a private horror that I later learned she mentioned in a phone call to Aunt Margaret. Tuesday evening. My mother did not call me. She called Aunt Margaret. She cried for 45 minutes. Aunt Margaret, who loves my mother but does not forgive easily, listened. At the end, my mother said, "I don't know how to come back from this." Aunt Margaret said, "You don't come back from it by calling me, Diana. You come back from it by calling Claire." Wednesday morning. Preston's father, the quiet man in the tan jacket who had said almost nothing at the reunion, called Benjamin Rook personally. He asked whether there was any scenario in which Ashford Brooks Holdings would consider an investor arrangement on the property. Benjamin asked me how to respond. I said, tell him the property is not for sale, has never been for sale, and will not be for sale. Benjamin told him. Preston's father thanked Benjamin. 6 hours later, Preston's father contacted his business attorney and began the process of unwinding Preston from the Sedona project entirely. Preston, I later learned, had believed for most of his life that his family's money was something he could spend ahead of earning. This was the week he found out he could not. Wednesday afternoon. The notary at the UPS store, a weekend shift clerk who had not, in fact, verified that my parents actually owned the property before stamping the quitclaim deed, received a letter from the state commission office. Her commission was suspended pending a hearing. She was eventually reinstated, but only after a written corrective practices course. I did not pursue further action against her. She had done nothing worse than what most weekend notaries at shipping stores do, which is to trust the paper on the counter. The paper on her counter had been wrong. That was not her fault. That was my mother's. Thursday morning. Meredith's credit card company, in a separate and entirely unrelated chain of events that surprised nobody, canceled her highest limit card due to a routine credit line review that flagged the cascade of negative events on her file. The HELOC withdrawal, the business loan default, the cosigner acceleration. Her credit score dropped from the low 700s to the high 500s in 9 days. My mother did not call me for 11 days. When she did, it was a short call. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. She said, Claire, I don't know how to say this. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the reunion. I'm sorry for the house. I'm sorry for all of it. I said, I hear you. She said, can we talk? I said, yes, but not this week. I need some time. She said, okay. That was the whole call. 3 minutes. I didn't cry after I hung up. I made a cup of tea in my grandmother's kettle, and I sat by the window of my condo, and I watched the city lights, and I thought about the 9-year-old girl who had been called difficult, and who had eventually grown up and bought a house. My father wrote me a letter, a real letter, on paper, in his handwriting. It was 4 pages long. It said many of the things he had said at the reunion, but with more detail and with the name of every specific moment in my childhood when he had known my mother was being unfair and had said nothing. The letter ended, I have been a coward my entire life. I do not know how to be anything else at 68, but I am going to try. You do not owe me anything. I love you. Dad. I put the letter in the brown accordion folder with the deed. Meredith texted me 4 times. The first was an angry, blame-shifting paragraph. The second was a demand that I give her the house back. The third was a threat involving an attorney she had apparently consulted who told her, in what must have been the fastest legal consultation in history, that she had no case. The fourth, 3 weeks after the reunion, said, Claire, I was wrong. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry. I did not respond to the first 3. I responded to the fourth 6 days later with a single line. I hear you. Nathan came to my condo for dinner the week after the reunion. He brought a bottle of wine he had clearly spent too much money on. He sat at my kitchen counter and he said, Claire, I want to be better. I don't know how yet. Will you let me try? I said yes. Uncle Gerald, my father's older brother, called me from the house one evening, from inside my house, and said, I always thought you were the smart one. I should have said so out loud. I'm saying it now. I thanked him. I did not tell him he was 20 years late. 6 months later. My parents are still in the house. They are paying rent, on time, on the 1st of every month, into the same LLC account. The amount has not changed. We have not renegotiated the lease. When my mother asked, through Aunt Margaret, whether we should make some other arrangement, I said no. The lease works. It is honest. It names who pays whom. I prefer it to the previous arrangement where nothing was named. Ashford Brooks Holdings has closed 2 new acquisitions since the reunion. The 48-unit build is 80% framed. I hired my first full-time acquisitions analyst, a 26-year-old woman named Tasha, who reminds me of who I was at her age. And I paid her more than I needed to, because someone should have paid me more than I got paid at 26. Aunt Margaret and I have dinner every second Sunday. Nathan comes sometimes. My father comes occasionally. He takes the bus because he will not let me send a car. And he arrives with a small wrapped gift every time, even though I've told him he does not have to. Last time it was a kitchen timer, because I had once mentioned 6 months ago that my old one had broken. He had remembered. The time before that, it was a hand-labeled jar of tomatoes for my mother's herb garden harvest, with a note in her handwriting that said only, "Thank you for the light." I do not yet know what she meant by it. I am willing, for the first time in my life, to wait until she is ready to tell me. Meredith I see once every few months. She has moved out of the house. She lives in a studio apartment in the city, where she has taken a job as an events assistant at a small PR firm. She is, for the first time in her life, earning her own money. She is not good at the job yet. She is, I am told, trying. My mother and I have lunch once a month. We go to a specific restaurant halfway between the house and my office. We talk about small things. I have not forgiven her exactly. I have done something else. I have stopped waiting for her to become the mother I wanted, and I have started letting her be the woman she actually is, which is a person who was frightened and jealous and small in ways she never admitted, and who is now, late and slowly, trying. That is not forgiveness. It is something quieter. A boundary drawn in ink that we both know the location of. The house is still there. Pine floors, stone fireplace, the back porch where I used to read in the summers. I drive past it sometimes, at dusk, on my way home from a site visit. The porch lights come on automatically at 6:30. My mother's herb garden is in the back. My father is usually somewhere inside. The house is full of my childhood, and also of a family that has, for the first time, had to reckon with who actually built its foundations. I own every brick of it. And for the first time in my life, that fact is something I no longer have to keep secret, or quiet, or careful about. I want to say something to the woman watching this who has been called difficult her whole life. Being difficult in the family you were born into often just means being accurate. It means noticing things other people have agreed not to notice. It means asking questions other people have agreed not to ask. It means doing, quietly, the arithmetic your family has asked you to stop doing out loud. My family put me on the guest list at an event hosted in my own house. They did it because for 33 years, I had never shown them the paperwork. They had no way to know I had the paperwork, because every system they ran, every toast, every holiday, every decision, was designed to make sure I would be the one who never needed paperwork. The quiet one, the flexible one, the one who would not argue. They were right that I was quiet. They were wrong that quiet meant unprepared. You do not have to yell to be heard. You do not have to cry to be believed. You do not have to explain yourself at a table full of people who have spent your whole life not listening in order for the truth to become the truth. Sometimes you just set a document on a sideboard and you let the document do the work that your voice was never allowed to do. Boundaries aren't walls, they're architecture. And architecture, if you've built it right, holds up the house whether or not the people inside the house ever look up and notice the beams. I noticed the beams. I laid them. I signed for them. And when the night came that my mother reached for a document that wasn't hers, I was already the one who owned the room. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. If this story reminded you of someone, yourself, a sister, a daughter, A version of you at 9 or 16 or 33? Tell me in the comments. And I want to ask you one question before you go. Would you have walked into that reunion with the deed in your hand? Or would you have let it die quietly in the title office and stayed the quiet one forever? Walked in or stayed quiet? Drop your answer below. If you want more stories like this one, real reversals, real paperwork, real women who stopped waiting, check the description below. Subscribe to Broken Relations. I'll see you on the next one.